Well, for the final time in this 2024-25 season, in season two of Hoist the Colors, Tim Best, Pat Madden with you, just to wrap up the season that mercifully ended about almost 3 weeks ago at Madison Square Garden with a tough loss to Villanova. Um, I'm I know that I trust me, I don't want to talk about this because this is supposed to be like a segue into the offseason, but I mean, we did preview it. We put all that time and effort into it. We're not going to go too deep into detail, but if you were living under a rock and missed that game, I don't blame you because of the fact that, I wouldn't want to watch it either. But if you did, I guess good on you, and you might be a masochist. And I feel like I'm being a little mean when I say that. But, anyways, Seton Hall, they struggle early against Villanova. They go down pretty big at the half, make a huge charge. And by the way, hold Eric Dixon scoreless in the first half. And then Eric Dixon goes absolutely ape shit in the second half. Pat, I know you were in the building. I feel like take a shot every episode and say, Pat, you were in the building. But yeah, tell me what you saw in the Garden. I was
Didn't
watching at home
didn't
on Peacock.
didn't stay around in the garden.
Okay, I don't
I had
blame you.
work the next morning, so I saw the two games before that, but I did not hang around for. I mean, the sense I got is, look, it was like a lot of other games we saw this year. They go down big early. Uh, you can either you we know the reasons why they go big down early because it takes a while for them to wake up. It takes a while for them to figure out who's going to be the scorer that day. From what I can recall, uh, and then they make a little run in the second half, and then Villanova just, it's sort of it's sort of bittersweet moment on both ends because on the one hand, it was the end of the hideous 7-25 season for us. On the other hand, it would turn out to be the last game that Kyle Neptune would win as Villanova coach. And that's another discussion for another day. We'll probably talk about it next season about what's gone down at Villanova since we last checked in a few weeks ago. If we had even checked in last Thursday, things would be different at Villanova than they were today. So, and of course, Isaiah Coleman puts out another big effort in his last game, or presumably what could be his last game at Seton Hall. You know, you could ask the question as to whether or not these big scoring outputs in the last during the Big East portion of the season were Isaiah Coleman giving his all for Seton Hall, or whether it was Isaiah Coleman giving his all to impress potential suitors in the transfer portal. So, that's sort of, you feel bad for Dylan Adewusu, who played his last game as a collegian, his last game at Seton Hall. Uh, left it all out in the court. Obviously, Chauncey Jenkins unfortunately didn't get his chance to have his farewell moment as a Pirate. Yassine Toomey, of course, played his last game at Seton Hall, and the less said about Yassine Toomey, the better. And then Gus Yalden hit the portal, which that's another. Maybe we can hit about that topic later. But the point is, you know, it was like almost every other Seton Hall game during the Big East, except for the handful of blowouts and the wins against DePaul and Connecticut. Fall behind early, make a little run early in the second half to keep people interested and not turn the TVs off right away, and then Villanova drops the hammer down the stretch.
Yeah, so I was, after it got to 30, I'm trying to find out what the score was. Listen, they made it a game. They only had 17 points in the entire first half and then went on a big run to cut it down to 8, 37-29. And then once Dixon finally got on the score sheet and he made a three to cut it to get the lead back to double digits, honestly, in my opinion, I could just tell it was a wrap. I will say, Coleman, he showed out. Like, if this was his last game as a Seton Hall Pirate, which a lot of people are assuming it will be, he had a great game, 25 points, shot 50% from the floor. His three-point shot wasn't falling. But what really surprised me, Prince's league-based three-point shot was falling. He made both three-pointers that he took and finished with 10 points, which was a solid night. Um, Manny Okorafor was solid off the bench. He had 8 points, 4 for 4 from the floor. It sucked to see Dylan Wusu foul out in his last game, but honestly, I don't think anyone's surprised. Like, if there's any way for your DAW to go out, it's fouling out and just giving everything he's got for his last game. But yeah, once Eric Dixon got going, there was no chance in hell of Seton Hall stopping him. So honestly, merciful end to the season. I hate to I think I speak for all Seton Hall fans. Like, we're glad it's over. We got to turn the page. And speaking of turning the page, we talked about the roster um, and the changes that are going to be made. Coleman's in the porter. You mentioned Gus Yalden's in the portal. Um, I mean, what are you making overall with the developments that we've been seeing throughout this frame of time that John Rothstein has so eloquently called it portal combat?
It's sort of hard to figure out how things are. It the obvious, I guess, the one obvious thing is that not as many of the Seton Hall players are in the portal as one might expect
Mm-hmm.
because the season went so poorly. Because you would expect that these guys might want, if I don't know what they think things are going to be like next season. On the other hand, one thing which doesn't get mentioned a lot is the progress that players who come in and play a second year for Holloway have. Uh, think about last year's team. Richmond, Dawes, and Dre Davis were all playing their second year under Holloway because they had played in Holloway's first season when Seton Hall ended up 17 and 16. Uh, and then they all come back for a year when they end up winning 25 games. And they all were better in their second season. Richmond was more consistent than he was his I think what would that be, his junior year. The leap he made from his junior year and senior year was to gain more consistency as a player and to be a more dominant force on the offensive end. Uh, Alamir Dawes became a more uh, diverse scorer and a more consistent scorer. And then Dre Davis made a seamless move from being a sixth man or a seventh man on the bench to being a day in and day out starter, and and proving that he could play more minutes and get production as opposed to being like a 15 to 20 minute guy. He becomes a 25 to 30 minute guy, and his production didn't drop off. So it'll be interesting to see which of the guys. And if you look at this year's team, Isaiah Coleman obviously uh, bumped his scoring average up. He doubled at least. I think he at least doubled. He doubled his score. He took a quantum leap scoring average wise. Now he's playing more minutes and he's getting a lot more shots. But in terms of, he was able to develop himself as a very dangerous scoring threat. If Seton Hall hadn't had such a bad record, he probably would have been at least a second or third team All Big East guy. And even Wusu. This was his only year in college, averaging double figures. Now he was injured most of the season. On the other hand, you can't take away the big game he played against DePaul. You can't take away the big first half he had at the Rock against Villanova late in the season. So in that sense, he was becoming more. He had become a better scorer than he had any of his 4 years prior to that. So in terms of what you're looking at for next season, uh, what can we expect certain things out of some of the guys who may or may not be, of course, obviously the portal's open until the end of April. So we still have a few more weeks to see how things sort of shake out. But in terms of, if you're saying everyone's going to jump, only three guys have jumped. One was Coleman. a lot of people sort of expected that. One was David Tubeck, and I don't know what to think. I don't. Tubeck never really got a groove. Into he had his flashes. Uh, he obviously he had that big game against VCU in the Charleston Classic, but after that, he was mostly this season out of sight, out of mind, after being a total non-factor his freshman year. So I don't know what anybody's expectations of Tubeck were going to be, given what he's been. It parallels a lot Jaquan Sanders. And then Gus Yalden. I feel bad for Gus Yalden. I think he generally got his act together this season, as opposed to what I had read about what he was like at Wisconsin. Unfortunately, watching if you objectively look at his game and you drown out how excited everyone was when he got a rebound or when he hit a basket, or I forgot what game he actually hit a 3-point shot in. He hit a 3-point shot against somebody late in the season. Uh, I want to say it might have been Marquette. I don't remember. I don't remember the top of my head. He drained the three at some point. It sort of in like a maybe it was Butler, like a late last ditch garbage time 3-point shot.
Mm-hmm.
So every time he did something, people went nuts. Problem is, if you watched him closely and you put the blinders on to how much you like the guy, uh, he's got a lot of work to do in terms of getting his body in shape and in terms of improvements he needs to make on his game in order to be an effective college player. Now maybe a step down to a mid-major would help him out if he's being guaranteed minutes. If he's being, if he's not playing guys as big as he is, he could be a productive college player. Unfortunately, I think when you have to play in the Big East and your competition are the likes of Zuby Ejiofor and Terrace Reed and some of the
Kalkbrenner.
other, well, I mean,
Well,
Kalkbrenner is
well,
not an issue going forward. I'm just
yeah.
saying
Okay, I know what you mean.
the guys he's got to play next year who are conceivably going to be the starting centers or the starting big men for some of the other Big East teams. NJ Benson of DePaul comes to mind. When you've got to play guys like that, uh, he just didn't look like he didn't look like he was ready on a night in night out basis to take on the best centers in the Big East.
Mhm.
So I hope he find maybe he goes someplace back close to home, uh, and gets his and gets to actually work on his game as opposed to having to worry about making making a contribution against players who he's clearly not on their level in terms of what type of skill set he has and in terms of how he can match up to them physically.
Well, if he's going to go back home to Wisconsin, he better not go to Green Bay. I know. I think everyone knows why. Um, yeah, I wouldn't want to be playing for a podcaster as a head coach. No offense.
Although what type of NIL is he going to get? If Doug Gottlieb pays him enough money and wants to put a sideshow, I hate to say that Gus Yolden would be a sideshow, but he brings in this local hero to be his star, and there's a story behind that if he went to someplace. I think you're right though in the general sense that you want to play for a coach who's going to actually take coaching seriously.
Yeah, I mean, amen to that. I mean, I will. I mean, I wasn't surprised one bit that Coleman went into the portal, and I clearly, when you're playing that well, and he was very close to tripling his scoring output from a year ago. He only averaged like 5.4 points a game. He went up a full 10.2 points in his scoring average from last year. So he's going to be a highly sought after commodity for any of these Power Four schools for sure. Tubeck, um, obviously not that big of a loss. Gus Yalden on the other. Gus was a vibes guy. He's the kind of guy that like you gravitate towards, and he's the again I use the term vibes guy, and keeps morale high with an upbeat attitude. But yeah, you have to put the blinders on and realize that like he, from a statistical standpoint and just from a basketball standpoint, you got to cut off the dead weight. And I hate that I'm saying this about Gus because Gus is an objectively good kid, but dead weight. So you got to improve and get guys who are better and make your roster better than what you had last year. So, and I think that segues into a perfect question of what should Shaheen Holloway be looking for? I mean, if you got a couple guys in mind, if you want to name drop some people that are in the portal, that would be great acquisition. Great, but if not, what do you think Shaw's team's biggest needs are going into next year?
It depends again on what stays, what ultimately stays in this team. If you look at what they have right now, uh, I know somebody does a really good job on the scholarship chart, and I don't have it in front of me, but I think I can recall much off the top of my head. What you have right now is you have in terms of who is Prince of Lake Bay is going to be here. No questions asked. I think he's Holloway's favorite. I think he's going to be the starting power forward next year. I think he's done enough to prove that, at least you put him in the lineup. Now, whether you, depending on how many minutes you give him, depends on what else you bring in. I think ideally you'd like to have someone more like Dre Davis, who is more of an offensive threat in that position. But in terms of being a Holloway guy, pure in and pure out, no one fits that mode better than Prince Olave. Uh, then you get to God's will, Aaron Aaron. Uh, I think ideally you'd like to have somebody else come in at the center position who you would think is going to make more of a Jaden Bediako type coming in to play with Aaron Aaron, and hope that, now if Aaron Aaron is getting 20 minutes consistently a night, he continues to develop the abilities he started to show late in the season of being really good at putback rebounds, a guy you could start to work some pick and roll with and hit him on some alley oops, a guy who's showing he could start to be a rebounder on both ends of the court. And I think if you bring somebody in for a season who can sort of take the pressure off, that would be something that would be nice to have. I think nobody's entirely sure if Scotty Middleton's going to hang around or not. He hasn't jumped in the portal yet. Uh, the question with guys like Scotty Middleton is that what happens if you had a legitimate point guard on this team? Could they have run more plays and gotten Middleton more open shots? Or is the issue that Middleton was too passive on this team? But again, that he could be the type of guy who, if he does hang around, maybe Holloway can light the same type of fire he lit under Isaiah Coleman this offseason and get him to be more assertive on the offensive end. Then you get the Garway Dual, who a lot of people think he improved as the season went along. He obviously and he had an injury early in the season that might have hindered his abilities before we got to Big East play. But he's still 6'5". He still has a lot of length on the perimeter defensively. He's still someone who gets a lot of deflections and gets some steals. The issue is, what does he contribute offensively? And, is he a guy who you can continue to develop to be a credible ball handler on this team? Because one thing he was improving on as well was his passing ability. So we know he can play. The question is, that can he harness his talent and harness his ability and take himself up to a level which is consistent with somebody who should be starting on a Big East team? And then maybe the fifth guy is Deshaun Felton, who showed some flashes his freshman year. He had a couple of nice games, and then there were a couple of games where he looked like he was totally overmatched. And I think the question with a guy like Felton is, what is his ideal role. Uh, I don't know if he's a point guard. He wasn't a point guard in high school. I don't know if he like Holloway put him mostly at the point to see if he could handle the ball, handle the offense. And it was good sometimes, it was not so good some other times. So maybe if you put him more of a role he was comfortable in as a shooting guard, maybe you can get more. I mean, I forgot what his shooting percentage was from three, but it wasn't that bad relative to the rest of the team. So I think, you might be able to get something out of Felton. And then the wild card might be Emmanuel Okorafor. Uh, was what happened to him in the run up to the season to the point where he was never what he was never what he could have been. And is it something where Holloway takes a chance, hopes that he can stay healthy, and then maybe gets to a point where you can get a contribution out of him playing a position as a big man. So that's sort of what I mean. I think in terms of ideally, you'd like to get a guy who is a point guard and a pure point, somebody who's not a combo guard, guy who's a true point guard, whether he's your backup or whether he's your starter. At least someone who has played point guard most of his career. I know there's a guy who was a big shot at I think it was Merrimack. I forgot what I think his name was Bud Clark, who is a guy whose name has come up a lot in conversations. I don't know if he's coming in for a visit soon. He's a guy who I think he was all Metro Atlantic Conference as a point guard from Merrimack. Merrimack, they had a really good season up there. So he's a guy who you might be able to slot in that point guard position. I don't know what they're looking at in terms of big guys yet. I know a lot of the other names that are buzzing around are sort of those. I think Holloway's focus, at least early on, is to try and find a true replacement for Isaiah Coleman. And I think some of the names that are being mentioned in that category are fitting the mode of a guy who you could bring in to be the next Isaiah Coleman. So then, then the next question is: is Seton Hall legitimately looking for that type of guy you could play with? Either a guy who you could play with a Link Bay as his offensive counterpart, or is it a center that you could help continue Aaron Aronet's development? So those are the things that are going to play itself out probably in the portal over the next few weeks, probably into the beginning of May.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to rolling the dice on Okorafor, this might just be me personally. I don't think there was enough there to convince me that he would be worth bringing back. And I hate to say it because, like, at the end of the day, like, back in my day, like, guys stayed. So and it's not like there were very few instances where guys were essentially run out of town, unless they just simply didn't have a spot on the team. You could argue like Manny Okorafor should and does have a spot on the team. Me personally, I just think there's too much of a risk to take that chance on him to see if he can be what people were expecting of him before that setback before the start of the season. Um, when it comes to Ari Arane, I do agree with you. You want to find another big, a veteran big, with a similar amount of experience that Okorafor had, that can help him develop. And I think you nailed it right on the head. The Jaden Bediako type. I think that's the perfect description you could ask for that could complement Ari Arane and his development. In terms of a scorer, I think that arguably I would put that as like a bit of like a 1A priority, where the number one priority is you gotta have a point guard. that is going to help run the offense and is a true point guard. I think it was unfair to expect Dylan Wusu to handle those duties from the beginning of the season. Same with Garway Dual. I think Garway showed enough for me, at least, that he has a spot on this team and can build off of this because he was dreadful on offense to start the year. But as things progressed, his 3-point shot improved. He wasn't as timid on offense and definitely wasn't afraid to take it to the hoop with all that 6'5" frame of his. And defensively, we know what to expect out of him. Getting out in the passing lanes, getting steals, and turning and getting points in transition off those turnovers. Um, so I think at the end of the day, um, Ari Arane, I want to see Jasim Felton back, but I want to expect more out of him because we know how much potential he has. But I think you're right in the sense of he's got to play more of his natural position. Um, and I feel like there's got to be there was a good example of someone who like Mamu. Mamu's a great example. Granted, different position, but he was so much better as a stretch four than he was playing the five as a sophomore in 2019. Don't get me wrong, he was more than serviceable in that role in helping Seton Hall get to the tournament on a team that really wasn't expected to do much after the graduation of um, Angel Legato, Kadeem Carrington, Desi Rodriguez, and Ishmael Sonogo. Um, so, yeah, I'm intrigued to see what they're going to do and if more guys enter the portal. And I'll tell you what, with Scotty Middleton, he really has so much potential. And we've seen his 3-point shooting when he's on, he's on. And we know what he's capable of defensively. He's lanky, he's got a pretty good wingspan. He is a what you would expect out of a small forward. Like he fits that mold so perfectly that I'd be remiss to say that he should be the starting small forward on this team for the 2025-26 season unless they scoop someone up in the portal that earns that spot over him. I don't see Scotty as a four. He sure as hell ain't a shooting guard because he's just too big for that role and he's too short for the power forward spot and he's not strong enough to be the four. As the three though, that is right in the sweet spot. That is perfect, a perfect role for Scotty Middleton. I mean, I don't really know what else more there is to say because there's still so much to be learned in the portal. And rosters aren't going to be finalized until, as you mentioned, the end of April, which I still can't believe it's going to be April tomorrow at the time.
It could be the middle of May. Now, of course, let's look at something else for a second here. Let's look and see if what type of style of play Shaheen Holloway wants to bring out next season. Uh, was the success they had playing a pressing, trapping type defense, was that successful because they played in desperation? All those games that they made those great comebacks and they forced all those turnovers in. I mean, one thing Seton Hall did very well this season was force turnovers. They didn't capitalize on the turnovers they forced, but they were the forced turnovers. So does Seton Hall play more of that type of style next season? And that plays into the strengths of Dual and Middleton and Alik Bay. It plays into their strength to play an aggressive, trapping, ball pressure style. Uh, and you work with that, and then do you bring guys in who are going to also be in that type of mold. Now, when you're talking about bringing in a true point guard, do you bring someone who, maybe a guy who maybe not be the biggest guy, maybe he's not someone like, I guess you don't you don't necessarily look for a Tristan Newton of Connecticut type, or a guy or Kadari Richmond type, as sort of like your big guard to play that position. Do you focus upon a guy who frankly is more like what Shaheen Holloway was like as a player? And do you then do you again to get a guy who's capable of pressing and trapping and causing deflections and using that as Seton Hall's defensive style? I don't know if we can get a roster of the same caliber as, let's say, St. John's had last season, where, St. John's just pummeled you by getting every rebound under the sun, uh, forcing you into mistakes and turnovers and turning defense into offense. Obviously St. John's was not the greatest team in the world at playing half court offense because they shot the three so miserably. But what they beat you on was offensive rebounds. Can Seton Hall do that as a pressing, trapping type team? What is going to be what is going to be their identity next season? And do you just find guys who are going to fit that identity? Or do you go to entirely new identity? Do you basically say, you know what, we need to get the best players we can get available. We need to get shooting. We need to get rebounding that we can trust and that type of stuff rather than uh, rather than just basically trying to fit, round pegs in the square holes, so to speak. So I'm going to be interested to see the guys you pick up in the portal. What type of how do you decide you're going to play next season with the combination of the guys you have coming back and the guys you're bringing in coming in off the portal? That's really what the big question is, and that's something which you're going to have to wait until the middle of May or even maybe the beginning of June to sort of figure that type thing out, to look at the guys who are coming in and say, all right, what did this guy do well at his previous school? And so on and so forth. So I think that's basically what, and then the other thing which might or may not be part of the mix is there's still a bunch of high school kids who are theoretically available. Uh, Now I don't know if there's anybody out there who automatically comes into your starting lineup next season, but if you are going to play an aggressive trapping style, you do have to have a few guys on your bench who are capable of being, minutes guys. I think one of the mistakes, as much as Holloway made mistake by trying to go with a rotation where 11 or 12 guys could play equally well and be plug and play. If you're going to play an aggressive style, you can't just rely on a 6 or 7 man rotation. And maybe you find a couple of high school kids who are floating out there who you may be able to give 5 or 10 minutes to. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure that's really what that's really what the people who are that's really what the staff's got to be thinking about in terms of what hopefully and hopefully that process started the day after they lost to Villanova 18 days ago, which is what do we do to get us to make us better than we were this season.
Yeah. So the last thought I'll leave, just to talk about while I do get your point, we don't need a guy similar to Tristan Newton or Kadari Richmond. However, uh, just to like play devil's advocate here, I'm going to throw out a name that he wasn't like 6'5", 6'6". He was 6'4" and was a great scorer at his old school, but then turned into a very good point guard who played his role perfectly and fits the Shaheen Holloway mold of being a really good defensive player too. Quincy McKnight. If we can get a Q type of player to run the point, that would be fantastic. Like that would be my ideal scenario. If they can get a guy like him, that'd be great. I think that the next best option being that like quintessential point guard, like 6'1" to 6'3" height, who runs an offense well, protects the ball well, can score it, but he knows his role in getting the ball to the top scorers of the team.
I mean, McKnight, of course, a couple of points about McKnight. One is he came in an era. I know this is not too long.
It feels like it.
We're talking about for the last decade here, but he had the city here. He had the opportunity to learn how to play with Miles Powell and Sandri Mamukelashvili, uh, and the guys who were the stars of that last great Seton Hall team from 2019. He got the chance to play with those guys. He got the chance to practice for a year without having to be thrown into a game. Obviously, that's not how things work. That's not how things work in 2025. In 2025, everyone you put bringing in, you're not bringing in a guy off the pool because unfortunately, what happens too often in those situations is you pick a guy off the portal and you say, you know what, you're going to have to wait a year, and that guy basically at that point loses all interest in waiting and says, I'm never going to get a chance to play. It's funny that there's a guy being floated out there. This guy, I'll throw one more name out there. This guy, Naz Cunningham, who's a New Jersey guy who got recruited by Alabama. And Alabama specifically told him at the beginning of the season, we're going to redshirt you because we would rather you play no minutes than if we give you 5 minutes a game. We want to see how you develop in practice. And apparently, Cunningham told Alabama, I'm not, you didn't play me this season. I don't appreciate it. I'm heading to portal. Uh, and there are rumors that he could be someone in the mix up at Seton Hall. Now, the question is, does a guy like that, he obviously a talented guy, you don't get Alabama does not recruit you if you're not talented.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is he more of a Scotty Middleton type who's going to need some time to work through Holloway's system, or is a guy who steps on the court right away and becomes a double-digit scorer? I mean, that's really something which, I mean, I think the one thing I think which is obvious is that if you look at this team right now, you need to find scoring and you need to find shooting. And if that comes from a point guard, if it comes from a power forward, if it comes from a wing, at least find some guys on the court who you can absolutely trust are going to score, have the ability at any time they get the ball to score the basketball. Right now, honestly, within the six guys we've talked about, I don't think I trust that of any of those guys between Dole, Felton, Middleton, Aligbe, uh, Aaron Aronay, or Okorafor. None of those guys are. I put them on the court and I trust them as 15 point a game guys. I don't trust any of those. Some of those guys have the potential to score 15 points in any given game, but not like an automatic bucket. That's not on this roster right now. At least one or two of those guys have to be on this roster when we get to the end of the roster building phase over the next 4 to 6 weeks.
And again, Portal Combat has fully commenced, and it'll be we're a long ways away from Portal Combat finally, those battles finally being over. So we got a long, long time before this roster fully crystallizes, comes into shape. So that's going to do it for the season 2 finale, I believe, of Hoist the Colors. When we come back in the fall, we'll have a roster, hopefully have a schedule, and well, yeah, it depends on how you come up with the schedule. But anyways, and we'll talk about what the Big East is going to look like because of the fact that, well, a familiar face to Seton Hall is back in the Big East as Pat pointed out, with Kevin Willard now being with Villanova. If this happened like after Jay Wright retired, this would be different, but Villanova is not the Villanova of when Kevin Willard was the coach. So it's not as bad. He is going to a rival, but it's not as like, I don't hate Villanova like I did when I was a student at Seton Hall. So it's not ill will, but I will say I'm very much looking forward to seeing Kevin Willard roast Adam Zagoria and Zach Braziller at Big East Media Day come October and throughout the season in general. So that much I'm looking forward to. So that's going to do it for season 2 of Hoist the Colors. For my trusted co-host, Pat Madden, I'm Tim Best. Thanks for tuning in. This was a great season. We were able to get some interesting guests, including a 2-time Super Bowl champion. Hopefully, we'll try to build off as we're trying to make season 3 third time's the charm. So until next time, until the fall, onward Setonia, y'all.